Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise and gets straight to the heart of what you need to know. Today, we're diving into, well, a pretty huge question. How do we design democracies that can really stand the test of time? Especially, in a world changing so fast with the digital age, aging populations, global migration. It's not just about surviving the next crisis. It's about building systems that can actually adapt and thrive, looking ahead maybe 20, even 50 years.
That's exactly right. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We've waded through, honestly, a stack of sources, everything from classic texts on constitutional design to some really fascinating global examples. The goal here is to figure out, okay, how can new constitutions be crafted, or maybe how can older ones be reformed to build in that long-term resilience, that adaptability, especially facing these huge ongoing shifts.
So what does this mean for you listening? Well, we're going to unpack some, I think, really insightful institutional choices, some unique features you might not have thought about, things that really shape how democracies actually work on the ground. We'll look at different government systems, direct democracy, like really direct democracy, and even some newer ideas for getting citizens involved. Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly informed about democracy's future. We've got some surprising facts, I think, and practical stuff you can actually think about. Ready to get into it?
Absolutely. Let's start with the basics, the sort of fundamental blueprint, the different kinds of liberal democratic systems out there. Because while they all share core things, competitive elections, rule of law, protecting rights, they come in a lot of different flavors. And designing a constitution, fundamentally, it's always about trade-offs, isn't it? Between governing effectively, making sure people feel represented, and keeping the whole thing stable.
Yeah, that trade-off idea is key. And one of the biggest distinctions people talk about is parliamentary versus presidential systems. So let's start with parliamentary. That's where the executive, your prime minister and cabinet comes from the legislature and depends on it, right?
Exactly. And a big advantage there is flexibility. If a government has a solid majority, it can move pretty quickly on policy. Accountability is also usually quite clear. Voters know who's in charge, who's responsible. Plus, you often get coalition governments, which means smaller parties can actually have some influence, get their voices heard.
And, crucially, if a leader loses confidence, they can be replaced relatively quickly. Maybe through a no-confidence vote. You don't have to wait years for an election. That quick changeability, that can really boost resilience in the short term, can it? It's actually striking when you look historically. Parliamentary systems seem more stable systemically. Fewer total collapses compared to presidential ones.
That's a really important point. Even something that looks messy, like, say, Israel having multiple elections in a short period. That's government turnover, not necessarily the whole system falling apart. But the flip side is potential instability. Especially if parliament's fragmented, coalitions can be fragile. You might get frequent elections, policy seesawing back and forth, and power can get quite concentrated in that parliamentary majority, sometimes leaving fewer formal checks for minority viewpoints.
Okay, so let's pivot to presidential systems. Here you've got a completely separate executive, usually a president, elected directly by the people. They don't need the legislature's confidence to stay in power.
Right. And the main appeal there is that direct mandate. The president can say, hey, the whole country elected me to lead. That's a powerful position. Fixed terms bring predictability, continuity. And in a crisis, a president can often act decisively because, well, getting rid of them midterm is usually really difficult. Plus, that clear separation of powers with an independent judiciary is supposed to be a safeguard for minority rights, a check on majority rule.
But that very rigidity, the fixed terms, that can be a major downside too, can it? If you have an ineffective leader or someone who's lost public trust, they're just there until the next election. That can really hamstring a country. And we've definitely seen how divided government present from one party, legislature controlled by another can just lead to total gridlock. Nothing gets done. There's also that risk of power becoming really personalized. A strong, maybe populist leader feeling they can bypass the checks and balances. That can edge towards authoritarianism if institutions aren't strong enough.
Yeah, and it's a key finding in the research. Outside the U.S., long-lasting, stable presidential democracies are actually quite rare. Latin America has many examples with histories of instability, although, many have become much more stable recently. Even the U.S. model, which is the oldest, shows both strengths that clear separation, but also real strains, like intense partisan deadlock and leaders definitely pushing the boundaries of constitutional norms.
So trying to get the best of both. Some places use hybrid or semi-presidential systems. France is a classic example, directly elected president, but also a prime minister who answers to parliament. And you could argue constitutional monarchies like the UK, Sweden, Japan sort of fit here too. They blend tradition, maybe a symbolic head of state, with an accountable parliamentary government. A different kind of balance.
Exactly. The idea is to get that strong leadership for direction, especially in crises, but keep the day-to-day government grounded in the assembly. But it can get complicated, especially if you have cohabitation, president and prime minister from rival parties. That can lead to infighting, and sometimes it's confusing for voters who's actually responsible here.
Okay, so that's about how governments are formed. But just as vital for resilience is how power is spread out geographically. Unitary versus federal states.
Right. Federal systems, think Germany, the US, India, Brazil power, is constitutionally split between the central government and regional governments, like states or provinces. That decentralization can be a real strength. It allows policies to be tailored locally. These regions can act as laboratories for new ideas. And crucially, if the national government stumbles, strong regions can provide a kind of backstop stability. Plus, you often get two houses in the legislature, one specifically representing regional interests.
Makes sense. But the downside of federalism can be, coordination headaches, making sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, and maybe uneven services across different regions.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
In contrast, unitary systems like France, Japan, Sweden's sovereignty is mainly held by the national government. The big advantage there is uniformity and speed. You can implement policies nationwide, quickly. Very useful in a crisis or for big national reforms.
But in those unitary states, local power or protecting regional minorities depends more on political decisions, not necessarily constitutional guarantees, unless there's specific devolution, like the UK giving powers to Scotland and Wales.
Precisely. Unless there's that specific devolution, local autonomy is more granted by the center rather than constitutionally enshrined as an independent power source. So it's a fundamental choice about flexibility versus uniformity, central control versus local autonomy.
Right. Let's shift gears again. This next bit, electoral systems, is often called one of the most significant design choices. These rules really are powerful levers, shaping the whole party system, who gets elected, how representative the government is.
Oh, absolutely critical. Broadly, you have two main camps. First, plurality or majoritarian systems. First past the post is the common one used in the US, UK, India's lower house. Basically, whoever gets the most votes in a district wins the seat. Simple as that.
And the upside usually leads to two dominant parties, often single-party governments. Clear winners, clear mandates, potentially decisive action, and it tends to keep smaller, maybe extremist parties out.
True, those are the arguments for it, but the trade-off, and it's a big one, is often representativeness. The sources really hammer this point. You get situations like in the UK where a party might win, say, 2/3 of the seats with only 1/3 of the vote. That was described as the most disproportional parliament in British history back in 2019. It creates this feeling of wasted votes for millions, and some argue it fuels polarization, locking in what they call an increasingly dysfunctional two-party system.
So that raises a big question. Is that short-term decisiveness worth potentially alienating a lot of voters long-term? What's the alternative? Proportional representation or PR?
Exactly. PR systems are widespread in Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands use variations. The basic idea is simple. Seats are allocated roughly in proportion to the votes each party gets. So if your party gets 20% of the vote, it gets about 20% of the seats. It just better reflects voting across the board. That boosts inclusiveness, legitimacy.
And because it's rare for one party to get over 50% under PR, you almost always get coalition governments, right? Which forces parties to compromise.
Precisely. And that often pulls policies towards the center, towards broader consensus. Think about Germany's post-war stability. Much of that is attributed to its coalition-based, moderate political culture shaped by its PR system.
Okay, but what are the downsides of PR? People worry about fragmentation, don't they? Too many small parties.
That's the main critique. Because even small parties, sometimes fringe or extremist ones, can win seats. Critics argue PR can help these groups get a foothold, translating diffuse votes into seats in legislatures. End quote. You see far-right parties, for example, with representation in most European parliaments now, and in some cases, yes, it can make forming a stable government really hard. Israel and Belgium have had long periods of deadlock. Decision-making can be slower. Accountability sometimes feels a bit blurred in complex coalitions. That's why many PR systems have thresholds like needing 4% or 5% of the vote to get any seats at all. Tries to weed out the tiny splinter groups.
So you get these two main models, each with pros and cons. Are there ways to kind of blend them, get the best of both?
People certainly try. That's where mixed electoral systems come in. Germany's system, which we mentioned is a good example, it combines local district representatives with partyless seats for overall proportionality. Personalized PR, they call it. New Zealand's a fascinating case. They actually switched from first past the post to a mixed member proportional system in 1996. That basically ended single-party rule there, opened the door for more parties like the Indigenous Maori Party and the Greens to get real representation.
It really shows how changing the electoral rules can fundamentally change the political landscape.
It absolutely does. It underscores that electoral system design is just this incredibly powerful lever for anyone thinking about constitutions. The research suggests that, broad PR, if you combine it with smart safeguards like thresholds and strong constitutional courts, can actually create very stable and inclusive systems. Look at Scandinavia.
Okay, beyond the big structures like government type and electoral rules, countries have come up with some really unique constitutional features, haven't they? Innovations worth looking at.
Oh, definitely. Switzerland is just extraordinary with its use of direct democracy. It's not just occasional referendums. It's baked into the system. We're talking votes maybe 4 times a year on all sorts of things. Citizens can launch initiatives to propose new laws if they get enough signatures. They can even force a referendum to veto laws passed by parliament.
Wow, that's a lot of voting. What's the effect of all that direct power?
It forces consensus.
Yeah.
Because politicians know almost any law could face a public vote, they tend to negotiate really broad compromises beforehand to avoid challenges. This leads to their famous magic formula government, a grand coalition, including all the major parties, which has been the norm since 1959. Someone noted the real power isn't just the laws that get vetoed, but all the potential conflicts smoothed out before they even get to a vote. That consensus habit definitely adds to their stability.
Sounds empowering for citizens. But are there downsides? Does it slow things down?
It absolutely can make decision-making slower, more incremental, and organized interest groups can use the referendum threat as a powerful weapon. There's also the risk of populist outcomes or votes that might infringe on minority rights. The minaret ban is often cited as an example. It really relies on having a very engaged, informed population, and Switzerland has another safeguard. For major changes, you need a double majority, a majority of voters nationwide, and a majority of the cantons, the regions. That protects smaller cantons.
Fascinating. Let's switch to something quite different. Militant democracy. That sounds intense. Germany's basic law is the key example here.
Yes, it's a concept born directly from the ashes of the Weimar Republic's collapse and the rise of Nazism. The idea is a democracy able to defend itself. Straight bear democracy. They deliberately built tools into the Constitution to fight anti-democratic forces.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, crucially, the Constitution allows for banning political parties if the courts find they actively seek to undermine the free democratic order. This was used against neo-Nazi groups in the 50s, and there's ongoing debate about the far-right AfD party now. They also have a domestic intelligence agency specifically tasked with monitoring extremist threats. And maybe most fundamentally, there's an eternity clause protecting the core principles, human dignity, democracy, rule of law. Those cannot be amended, ever, not even by a supermajority.
So the benefit is clear. It's designed to make the system resilient against being overthrown from within. A strong message that democracy won't tolerate its own destruction. But isn't there a tension with basic freedoms like speech and association?
Absolutely. That's the core tension. It puts a huge responsibility on the courts and security services to draw that line very carefully between genuine extremism and legitimate, even radical dissent. There's always a risk it could be misused. Germany has generally used these powers quite sparingly and always with significant judicial oversight. Spain and Italy have some similar, though maybe less extensive, provisions too.
Okay, another key element for resilience. Strong, independent institutions acting as checks on power.
Yes, vital. This includes things like a truly independent judiciary, especially powerful constitutional courts like Germany's Federal Constitutional Court that can actually strike down laws. Also, independent bodies running elections, like India's Election Commission. The ombudsmen concept, which started in Sweden to investigate citizen complaints against the government. National human rights commissions, all crucial.
And these institutions really matter, don't they? They uphold the rule of law, guard against governments overreaching. South Africa's post-apartheid constitution is often praised for creating strong watchdogs like the public protector and its constitutional court.
Exactly. And you could include term limits for executives here too, like the U.S. president's 2-term limit. The idea to ensure political renewal prevents someone from becoming entrenched, a president for life.
Though the flip side is you might lose experienced leaders or get those lame duck final terms where not much happens.
True, another trade-off. Then there are specific arrangements designed for deeply divided societies, consensus, and power-sharing mechanisms. Think of consociationalism. Belgium, Lebanon are examples. These systems guarantee political representation for the main ethnic or linguistic groups, often through quotas in government or rotating leadership positions. Belgium's cabinet, for instance, constitutionally has to have equal numbers of Dutch and French speakers.
And the goal is basically to keep the peace, ensure all major groups feel included and have a stake in the system.
Precisely. It can be very effective for stability in diverse places, but it can also lead to deadlock or immobilism. Belgium's famous for its long periods trying to form a government. And critics argue, like in Bosnia, that rigidly locking in ethnic quotas can actually entrench those identities and hinder national unity. Switzerland offers a less formal but very effective version with its collegial executive, the Federal Council. 7 members representing different parties and regions sharing power, with the presidency rotating yearly. That magic formula again.
Right, very stable, but maybe less responsive to big shifts in public opinion, less choice for radical change.
That's the trade-off they make. For designers thinking about stability in fragmented societies, these models offer really interesting, if complex, options.
Okay, now something that feels very current and potentially exciting. Deliberative democracy, like citizens' assemblies. Ireland's experience gets mentioned a lot here.
Yes, Ireland's been a real leader. They've used assemblies of randomly selected citizens like a jury, but for policy to tackle really tough, divisive issues, same-sex marriage, and, maybe most famously, abortion.
How did that work with abortion, the Eighth Amendment? That was incredibly contentious for decades.
It was. The Citizens' Assembly in 2016-17 brought together about 100 ordinary people. They spent months hearing evidence from all sides, medical experts, legal scholars, personal testimonies. They deliberated respectfully. And their recommendations for significant liberalization of the abortion laws were seen as highly credible, precisely because they came from this diverse group of informed citizens, not just politicians. It really helped break the political deadlock and pave the way for the successful referendum that followed. It showed how bottom-up citizens' input can complement and enhance representative democracy.
So the idea is these assemblies can tackle complex, maybe emotionally charged issues in a less partisan way than politicians can, and build broader public understanding and support for difficult decisions.
Exactly. They can increase buy-in, educate the public, but it's important to remember they're usually just advisory. Their recommendations can be ignored. Success really depends on political will. Still, there are really promising innovations. Some are even talking about formally embedding them in constitutions for periodic reviews or major reforms. A mini public feeding into the larger system.
Okay, so bringing all these different pieces together, what are the big principles for designing constitutions that are genuinely resilient and adaptable for the long haul?
Well, a core theme that comes through again and again is balancing rigidity and flexibility. You need to lock down the core values, the fundamental democratic principles, make them hard to change. But you also need pathways for the system to adapt peacefully over time. Otherwise, it just becomes brittle, outdated.
Right, too rigid and it breaks under pressure.
Yeah.
Too flexible and it's vulnerable to being captured or eroded by those in power. How do you strike that balance?
One clever approach is tiered constitutional design. This means different parts of the Constitution have different levels of difficulty to amend. So fundamental rights, or the basic structure of government, might need huge supermajorities, maybe even referendums to change. But other, less critical parts could be updated more easily, perhaps by a regular legislative vote. It creates an entrenched core for stability, but allows for evolution around the edges. Canada and India use elements of this. It's a smart way to get the best of both.
And the process of creating the Constitution matters too, right? For its legitimacy and durability.
Hugely important. The evidence strongly suggests that inclusive, participatory drafting processes lead to constitutions that people feel more ownership of and that last longer. South Africa's 1996 constitution is a great example, drafted through a really broad multi-party process with lots of public input. It built a strong foundation. So, future constitution making or major revisions should probably build in mandatory citizen consultation forums, maybe even citizens' assemblies. And existing democracies could consider periodic constitutional conventions, like some U.S. states have, just to review and recommend updates. It provides that crucial safety valve for peaceful change.
What about improving the nuts and bolts electoral systems, governance structures?
Absolutely key for ongoing resilience. Many older democracies, especially those grappling with polarization like the US and UK with first past the post, are debating electoral reform. Introducing more proportional elements could, arguably, reduce the winner-take-all nature, encourage broader representation, maybe lessen the antagonism. Independent commissions to draw electoral boundaries, fighting gerrymandering, that's another big one.
And you mentioned a specific parliamentary tweak earlier, the German model.
Ah, yes, the constructive vote of no confidence. Can't kick out the leader unless you've already agreed on who replaces them. It just prevents governments from collapsing frivolously, makes coalitions work harder to resolve disputes internally. Spain, Belgium use it too. It adds a lot of stability. These little details matter.
And underpinning everything is the rule of law. How do you make sure that holds firm, especially when politics gets rough?
Non-negotiable for resilience. You need constitutionally guaranteed judicial independence, a strong, enforceable Bill of Rights, those powerful watchdog institutions we talked about. Constitutional courts need unambiguous power to review and strike down laws that violate the Constitution. And how judges get appointed is critical. Processes involving multiple branches, maybe supermajorities, help prevent court packing by politicians. And in today's world, explicitly protecting media freedom and pluralism in the Constitution, like South Africa does, is becoming absolutely essential to combat information control and maintain informed debate.
What about emergencies? Constitutions need to allow for them, but we've seen how emergency powers can be abused.
A huge challenge, highlighted vividly by the COVID pandemic. Resilient constitutions need to define emergency powers very clearly, but also build in strong safeguards. Things like strict time limits on states of emergency, requiring legislative approval for any extensions, making sure fundamental rights are suspended only minimally, if at all, and always allowing courts to review emergency decrees. You have to anticipate that leaders might be tempted to use a crisis to grab power. Building these checks in beforehand is crucial to prevent that it's a classic route to authoritarianism.
Okay, let's widen the view again. What about massive social trends, like aging populations or global migration? How can constitutions help democracies adapt?
Yeah, these are huge, slow-burn challenges. Many developed democracies face aging populations, even shrinking ones. Constitutions can't change demographics directly, obviously, but they can shape the response. For example, embedding fiscal rules about long-term debt or pension sustainability to protect future generations. Maybe mechanisms to boost youth participation, like lower voting ages or stronger civic education mandates, because aging societies really raise the stakes around immigration, too.
Right. Aging societies often need immigration for economic vitality. But migration on a large scale brings its own challenges: integration, cultural tensions, potential political backlash.
Exactly. We saw how the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, for instance, really fueled anti-immigrant politics in Europe. And illiberal leaders definitely exploited those fears to try and weaken democratic checks and balances, often framing it as defending the nation.
So how can constitutional design help manage immigration more constructively, maintain public support, and avoid that kind of destabilization?
Well, constitutions can start by clearly affirming equal rights for all residents, regardless of origin. Setting up clear, fair, transparent processes for immigration and asylum is vital. Some suggest independent bodies to assess labor needs and set quotas, trying to depoliticize the numbers game. Canada and Australia, with their more managed points-based systems, generally seem to maintain better public consensus around immigration. You need investment in integration too: language, civics, anti-discrimination laws, maybe even local voting rights for long-term non-citizen residents to encourage participation.
Can the Constitution itself send a message of inclusion?
Absolutely. A preamble acknowledging the nation's multi-ethnic reality, like in South Africa or Canada, sets a really important tone. And as we discussed, proportional electoral systems generally do a better job ensuring minority groups get representation, which tends to reduce alienation and conflict. New Zealand's specific seats reserved for Maori representatives are a powerful example of constitutional recognition. It all works against that divisive us versus them framing.
Looking even further ahead, climate change is expected to drive more migration.
A massive future challenge. Resilient democracies will need frameworks, maybe legal status for climate refugees, definitely strong international cooperation agreements. Constitutions could even include commitments to that kind of global cooperation, recognizing some problems just can't be solved alone.
Okay, the digital age. This feels like a whole new dimension of challenges for democracy. Misinformation, surveillance, foreign interference.
It really is. And the experts are pretty frank. No democracy has fully cracked this yet. The challenges are huge and evolving fast. They potentially undermine the fundamental legitimacy of democratic processes.
What are the biggest threats we're seeing?
Well, there's disinformation, fake news, eroding the possibility of informed consent, messing with elections. Then there's algorithmic amplification of polarization echo chambers, making compromise harder. Direct cyber attacks on election systems are a constant threat. Mass surveillance capabilities by governments or private actors raise huge privacy and control issues. And while digital tools offer new ways to participate, there's the whole digital divide issue, unequal access, varying levels of digital literacy.
So faced with all that, what can constitutions or laws actually do? What are the promising ideas?
We're seeing moves towards enshrining digital rights to internet access, stronger data privacy protections, maybe drawing on things like the EU's GDPR, calls for transparency around social media algorithms, maybe independent regulators for tech use in campaigns. Estonia is often held up as a pioneer here, nationwide e-voting, lots of digital government services, but with a massive emphasis on cybersecurity and a secure digital ID system.
But tech solutions alone aren't enough, right? It's also about the people using the tech.
Absolutely crucial. Massive investment need in civic education and digital literacy, helping people become critical consumers of online information. This connects back to constitutional values, freedom of speech, yes, but also support for a pluralistic, fact-based press. Maybe public funding for quality journalism or independent fact-checkers. And we can also use tech for good democratic purposes, online consultations, participatory budgeting tools, making it easier to collect signatures for initiatives electronically. Future constitutions probably won't name specific technologies, but they could establish principles of open government and digital participation.
So it's about setting guardrails, protecting rights online, but also empowering citizens and maybe using tech to enhance democracy where possible.
Exactly. It's a dual challenge. Mitigate the threats, harness the opportunities, and the key takeaway from many sources is act before a major crisis forces your hand. Integrate these digital era safeguards proactively.
One last area, populism and what's called institutional drift. This is more subtle, maybe. The slow erosion of unwritten rules and norms.
Yeah, it's not always about dramatic constitutional changes. Sometimes it's about things like, say, long-standing Senate procedures in the U.S. being abandoned for short-term gain, or the politicization of previously neutral administrative bodies. Norms are hard to write into law.
So how do you guard against that slow decay?
Some argue for deliberately cultivating constitutional patriotism, fostering a public culture that respects not just the letter, but the spirit of the Constitution. Education, a free press, civic rituals all play a part. Maybe periodic, independent audits of democratic health, like international bodies or domestic nonpartisan commissions, just assessing how well democratic norms and practices are holding up. And then there are practical, often mundane-seeming reforms that actually make a big difference. Strong anti-corruption laws, transparent campaign finance, rotating civil servants to prevent capture, ensuring security forces are genuinely apolitical and under civilian control. Newer constitutions, especially in places that transition from authoritarian rule, often spell these things out much more explicitly, because experience showed just how crucial these seemingly background factors are for preventing democratic backsliding.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground. Wrapping this deep dive up, it's crystal clear there's no single perfect democratic blueprint, is there?
Not at all. But what we do have is this incredible global laboratory of ideas and experiences. Lots of lessons learned, often the hard way. The constant theme is trying to find that sweet spot effective government that can actually get things done, combined with broad, inclusive representation, all underpinned by robust protection for fundamental rights.
If you were sketching a resilient 21st century constitution based on all this, what might it include?
Well, you'd likely want an executive that's accountable, maybe parliamentary or semi-presidential. Definitely a highly proportional electoral system, but with sensible thresholds to avoid extreme fragmentation. You'd want to integrate citizen input more directly, perhaps through both direct democracy tools like referendums and deliberative bodies like citizens' assemblies. Strong independent courts, election commissions, absolutely essential. And crucially, those future-proofing elements, a tiered amendment process for that rigidity-flexibility balance, clear digital rights, and mechanisms for dealing with long-term challenges like demographic shifts or climate change.
And for those of us living in established democracies, it's not always about starting from scratch, right? Incremental reforms can make a real difference.
Absolutely vital. Retrofitting existing systems is where much of the action is. Think about the debates happening right now in the US and UK about proportional representation, or the EU trying to enforce rule of law standards among members. Japan grappling with immigration policy. Hopefully, this discussion gives you, the listener, a framework for understanding those debates, for seeing the trade-offs involved, and evaluating the potential impact of proposed changes.
Because ultimately, constitutions provide the structure, the rules of the game. But their resilience depends on more than just the text, doesn't it?
It really does. At the end of the day, a resilient democracy needs a culture to match. A culture of tolerance, of active, informed citizenship, a shared respect for facts and reasoned debate. Constitutions can encourage that culture, protect the spaces where it can flourish. But ultimately, democracy's strength rests on the ongoing commitment of its citizens and leaders.
So, the final thought for you to take away. How might you use these insights? How can you observe, analyze, maybe even participate in shaping the democratic future unfolding around you in your own community, your own country, and globally? Something to think about